Future. We have a small but robust panel of 2 people, which means that we'll have more time to talk, hopefully, which we never get to do with these kinds of things. So this is also a warning for the audience that it's also on you guys to come up with like questions and interesting things to say after. My co-moderator, Delise, had a slight issue getting here this morning, but she's going to be coming in soon, hopefully. So I'll just go ahead. My name is Jess. I'm a writer and academic here in Montreal. And I'll go ahead and introduce our first speaker, who is Adjoa Aful. She's an MA candidate at York University in the Department of Humanities, currently working on her major research paper that examines how an Afrofuturist feminist epistemological framework may serve to complicate and resist current US-centered and heteropatriarchal master narratives of Black migration, transnational racial formations, and countercultural production. So without further ado.
Oh, okay, right. Yeah, I think so. Oh, okay. Thanks. You guys can hear me? Oh, yeah. Okay, awesome, thanks. So, let's start. The popularity of Paul Gilroy's concept of the Black Atlantic has been a driving force in perpetuating the bias within the field of African diaspora studies towards understanding of North American Black identity formation and futurity that privileges African American and masculinist subjectivities and countercultural products. Gilroy, in his seminal book, The Black Atlantic, defines the concept as the Black Atlantic defines concept as the stereophonic, bilingual, or bifocal countercultural forms originated by, but no longer the exclusive property of Blacks dispersed within the structures of feeling, producing, communicating, and remembering that he has heuristically called the Black Atlantic world. However, by modeling his definition of and almost exclusively focusing on the countercultural products produced by African American men in his application of the term, Gilroy epistemologically circumscribes it to those who identify with that particular subjectivity, which then excludes Black women and migrants, especially Black migrants from outside the West and Africa. Already engaged in imagining alternative understandings of subjectivity in ways of relating not despite, but through differences of class, sexuality, gender, and race, it is my contention that Afrofuturist feminism may serve as a critical epistemology that not only addresses the axis created by Gilroy's notion of the Black Atlantic, but also creates the epistemological space needed to adopt more heterogeneous and feminist approaches to Black identity formation in North America. Susan Morris describes Afrofuturist feminism as transgressive feminist practices born out of or from across the Afro-diaspora as key to a progressive future. That was a quote. With this understanding of Afrofuturist feminism in mind, I will use Ethiopian-American R&B singer, songwriter Kilala Mizin Christos, professionally known simply as Kilala's 2013 mixtape Cut For Me, as my primary case study to help me illustrate how Afrofuturist feminism not only provides the critical tools necessary to help imagine and create progressive futures, Black feminist futures, but also help craft Black feminist alternatives to hegemonic, sexist, and US-centric conceptualizations of Black identity formations across North America. In a 2013 interview with Fact Magazine, Kilala reveals that she aspires to sound like 90s teen R&B singer Brandy, but in quotes, weirder, something she says that would resonate with most people, but then make them feel a little bit uncomfortable. You guys are familiar with Brandy, right? Yeah. Okay, I wasn't sure, so I queued up like a video just in case. Yeah. Do you want to listen to a little bit of Brandy? Like, it's not just me, right? give you an idea of the kind of sort of vocal aesthetics that Kelela is borrowing from. On the title track of her 2013 debut album, Cut For Me, Kelela's voice, instrumentals, and production work together to create a familiar sounding yet discordant single that marries late 90s pop R&B sensibilities with clunky synth rhythms that harkens to British 90s and early 2000s electro, dance, music, and hip hop. The confluence of aesthetics is what gives the track and the album as a whole its texture, which music critic Mark Fisher defines as the, quote, materiality of sound as a medium in and of itself rather than a carrier of meaning. Fisher argues that it is texture that gives electronic and other postmodern music genres its spectrality, so like its haunting feeling, and argues that texture is central to both Afrofuturism and sonic hauntology. Fisher explains that electronically recorded music from the 1950s to the 1990s once signified the future and still does to some extent, but a future that never came to fruition. And so music that references or is made from these recordings, like current indie R&B, and the music genres built around remixing these sounds, such as hip-hop, dance, and electronic music, are haunted by what he describes as a paradoxical nostalgia, which is nostalgia for all the possible futures lost with the advent of postmodernism. Often the productions on the records employ slick instrumentals meant to foreground the singer's voice. In essence, the voice kind of sits on top of an oral hierarchy and lends the sound or the recording a sense of authenticity by engaging in what Derrida describes as a metaphysics of presence, in which meaning is secured and settled by being attached to a body, and in this case, in the case of recorded music, the voice becomes a stand-in for the body. What contemporary music genres like hip-hop and R&B have done is in engaging in a postmodern practice of laying bare the seams of production, so meaning highlighting the technology that makes these recordings possible. Is engaged in a postmodern practice of laying bare the seams of production. Throughout Cut For Me, this postmodern aesthetic is juxtaposed against the smoothness of Kelela's vocals, thus embodying completely the paradoxical nostalgia that has come to typify dance music and R&B at this moment. The results are an uncanny mixture of temporalities where instead of granting the track a sense of authenticity, the voice throws the entire production into question, disorienting the listener in the process. Kelela's voice is girly and playful but dexterous and adept at navigating the difficult instrumental arrangements that often switches tempo without warning and competes instead of yielding to vocal authority. The listener is at once attracted and distanced by music, and I would like to argue then that this kind of arrangement may have a particular resonance for Black, migrant, or second or third generation children, either born on the continent or in the diaspora or in North America between 1980 and 1995, and who have since come of age. Brandy, another teen pop R&B artist in girl groups like Aaliyah, Black spelled B-L-A-Q-U-E, TLC, Monica, etc., were at the height of cultural relevance during a time when many of the Black African migrants and or their children of the first major wave of African migrants were entering their adolescence. Mostly marketed to teen girls and young women, the music of these artists then may have also represented one of the most accessible and readily recognizable pieces of Americana, a common point for migrant Black teens whose process of gender and racial identity formation in other respects may have differed starkly from their naturalized peers. These artists and their music thus provide an avenue to enter contemporary American or Black American teen culture to individuals whose own cultural roots may be planted outside of North America. Paterai argues that performances such as Kelela's, by engaging with the past that does not mirror their own histories or the histories of the singers, wreaks havoc on Western chronologies and loses its grasp on how we experience and embody and perceive time. Paterai calls this mode of cultural production nostalgia without memory. However, I think in the case of a Black American woman of Ethiopian descent mimicking an African American teen singer, a more useful term may be sonic hauntology, where memory is very much present but references a temporality different to its original referent that makes its presence known spectrally. For example, the oral texture of the title track on Cut For Me is spare but slightly out of rhythm, bass beat. and Kilala's smooth 90s era pop R&B vocals are put over this beat. The result is that instead of ceding to the background to give way to the singer's voice, the contrast between what's going on in the beats and what's going on in the voice puts the two elements at odds in ways that makes the sound as if the voice is trying to catch up to the beat despite its slow progression. So, cut for me, I have to keep up here. And this is just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about so you can listen for yourself. So this is the title track of the distracts the listener from focusing on them long enough to make sense of them. In describing her music writing process, Kilala confessed that, "I don't write lyrics, I hear the track and sing in gibberish over it. Then I try to fit words into the phrasing and melody that I already have set. Everything is left to chance." What Kilala's quote reveals is that the spontaneity of her lyrics alongside the broken bass beats that characterize her music complicates common sense understandings of realness or authenticity, which is something that Gilroy tries to get away from in his framing of the Black Atlantic as this kind of mythic place in which Black transnational and hybrid subjectivities transcend the racialized, national, and ethnic particularities. But Kilala's music undermines this myth by specifically orally mimicking African American singing styles, running the music both texturally personal, while still locating the genre within a specific history, African American history. Kilala's uncanny reproduction of Brandy's vocal aesthetics anticipates a nostalgic identification with it, but at the same time interrupts it by placing them over a beat that does not complement that history. In doing so, Kilala recreates that feeling of disorientation that may be familiar to so many second-generation Black Africans or migrants in America, and first and second-generation Americans who, by dint of being Black, are made to occupy a history and placed on a Western African-American temporality that is to some degree foreign to them. In a recent interview, the singer revealed that I've grown up feeling very American, but constantly othered by people. There's internalized racism and feeling weird about being second generation American. What is replicated in the texture of Kilala's music then is a sense of weirdness, where the emotion we feel in listening to her music may be hard to place. Like her vocals, we are constantly trying to follow the beat wherever it leads, and its refusal to follow a melodic rhythm means that there is nowhere for our ears to rest, thus replicating the feelings of restlessness, similar to how Gilroy frames his notion of rootlessness and his concept of Black Atlantic, but grounded in a specific locale and range of experiences, thus modeling a way of relating an experience of gender and racial identity formation across experiential differences. In an interview published, another interview published by British newspaper Guardian, Kilala also cites African-American singer Tracy Chapman as one of her major influences. Not so much musically, but because where Kilala trades in experimental electro R&B, Chapman has built a career by mixing musical aesthetics from African American folk, blues, rock, and jazz genres, but in Kilala's words, in terms of physical representation. In the same interview, Kilala explains that Chapman's 1987 debut album cover, where her head is bowed and her eyes are averted from the viewer, was, quote, an important thing that existed at the time, which just doesn't really exist right now in terms of physical representation and how hugely popular Tracy Chapman was. If that happened again today, would people be able to receive it? What the post suggests is that the differences in musical styles for both artists is secondary, to the emotional resonance that Chapman's cover engendered by how she chose to visually represent herself. The closing single uncut for me is Cherry Coffee, which is a melancholic ode to the final moments of a relationship and the preemptive heartache felt right before breakup. Atmospheric in its aesthetic, the single is also an oral tour of the speaker's emotional state that walks the listener through the mental exercises they engage in to help come to terms with the impending separation. The song begins with a series of distinctive bleeps that at first almost inaudible but grow louder as the single progresses. Okay, so that's the last video. So this is just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about with the progression of the beats.
Trust me, I feel better. Say it's over, baby. Been telling me for a while that you're gonna stop hurting, but
Okay, so you get the idea.
finally got through this.
The bleeds go on unaccompanied for a full minute before any other instrument is introduced, and then again at first, almost inaudibly, the synthesizers are introduced, and then a bass guitar which serves as the single's rhythmic spine, providing some structure for the rest of the other instruments to bounce off of and play with. As the synthesizers are also accompanied with the rhythmic clanging noise in the background, which is hard to play sonically, but would be instantly familiar to fans of 90s R&B, electronic, and hip-hop music from the UK, who will recognize the sound as an oft-used sonic trope by artists ranging from TLC to Massive Attack. Not the TLC from the UK, but the UK. The single clocking at 6 minutes. Kalala's voice is not introduced until a full 2 minutes and 26 seconds after the instrumentals begin. Kalala's voice makes a cautious debut on the track, where the softness and lightness of the vocals gives the impression of an artist tiptoeing around the instrumentals like they are around the subject matter in the song, leaving the listener unprepared for the heaviness of the lyrics that come later. This aesthetic choice allows the vocals a measure of fluidity that counters the hard rhythmic structures provided by the beats, but underlines the single's atmospheric or spectral elements. These production choices then, along with the vocals, creates the overall mood for the track, which is contemplative, but also creates a feeling of stifled catharsis, where the listener is left with the impression that the speaker is thinking out loud, but to herself and not to her soon-to-be ex-lover. Sonically then, Kalala is imitating Chapman's album cover in a sense where the same evasiveness in terms of how she represented herself visually, with her head bowed down and her eyes averted from her gaze. Similarly, both Chapman and Kalala rarely, if ever, use pronouns in their music. Conscious decision or not, this choice opens up the possibilities for models relating that relies on the experiential affinities of certain affects triggered sonically and lyrically across a multitude of temporalities, while still entrenched in the specificity of the experiences being articulated or hinted at. Judith Ann Perino argues that the cover song is, quote, both mundane and a queer aspect of popular music, and that the cover song might be considered a kind of drag, where a drag of voice and melody and harmony and instrumental parts that forms an important part of most popular musicians' early years of learning and performing. While not a direct imitation, in naming her influences and explaining how they have impacted her work, Kalala does position her performance as a kind of drag, but one that is temporal. Perino argues that temporal drag suggests that in some instances, gender performances can be traced to co-originals, and are in fact direct imitations insofar that they can be traced to past identities and that sensibilities are consciously revived. These performances perpetuate an alternative temporality that, according to Perino, reinvests the past, forcing the present moment into a complex relationship between the now of the performer and the then of the historical time. In other words, what performances create or model are queer temporalities and genealogies. By exploring these temporalities and genealogies using an Afrofuturism, a feminist Afrofuturist framework, I'd like to argue then that the complex relationship between Kalala's music and her influences are located at the intersections of Black, migrant, feminist, and queer politics, as expressed through R&B and R&B. that suggests that Black feminist hermeneutic that evades the androcentricity and the odd invasion of Africa in the hegemonic Black Atlantic discourses. The retro-styling of Kalala's vocals reroute the temporal trajectory of the instrumentals, which instead of pushing away from the musical traditions that precede them, ties the music to them in a way that suggests that sincerity of homage, but whose innovations on the original also suggest a radical shift, presenting new ways of relating to the original that supersede the temporal incongruities of her services music. It is my contention then that this shift presents a queernality in that it does not follow genealogy, that does not follow a heteronormative reproductive cycle, but instead presents a kind of reproductive homosexual affiliation that's borrowing from right now. That not only cuts across temporalities, but experiential differences of racialization of gender and sexuality. In the same interview with Pitchfork, Kalala cites the closing single of Chapman's self-titled debut album, For You, as a reference for Cut For Me's closing single, Cherry Coffee. She then reveals that the lyric, safe from the guards of intellect and reason, from Chapman's closing song, the line for me is, quote, it's like this isn't me filtering through my brain, it's going straight from my chest, out my heart. Moreno argues that a cover song can redirect the terms of self-identification from heterosexual visual recognition to homosocial vocal genealogies. In her music, Kalala crosses that boundary into outright imitation of Brandy's singing voice and pop R&B sensibilities and Chapman's lyrical and visual aesthetics. Going back to the same Pitchfork interview, Kalala's declaration that Chapman's lyric, safe from the guards of intellect and reason, from the single For You, allows her to, quote, again, not filter through my brain, but go straight from my chest out to my heart. Creates a direct link between Kalala's own creative processes and that of Chapman's. Moreover, in not using pronouns in the single, Kalala positions herself as the intended subject of that lyric. Put another way, given Chapman's influence on Kalala's work, in answer to the question, for whom does Chapman sing For You, the answer in this instance is Kalala. And so for the final portion of my paper, I'd like to explore how in creating the psychic sort of heterotropias through her music, Kalala haunts the recent past and in the process models alternative ways of relating across experiential differences that addresses some of the limitations of Black Atlanticism. For instance, the presence of the noises from gadgets such as beepers, cell phones, in music of the late 90s, sung by women, particularly for African American Black female artists, complicated economy between human and post-human as well as Black and technology. Samples are noticeably absent on testing, which means vocal synthses / instrumentals are centered throughout the album, and so instead of directly quoting her references through samples, Kalala instead paraphrases by incorporating familiar R&B or late 90s R&B aesthetics and tropes into both music and lyrics. Listening to her innovations on familiar R&B tropes changes our affective responses to them, which in turn alters how we experience listening to the originals. Another way, listening to Chapman's For You after having read that the song served as an inspiration for Kalala's Cherry Coffee creates a different set of affective responses that Chapman's album closer did prior to hearing Cherry Coffee. I'm almost done. So in essence, by appropriating familiar R&B tropes and Chapman's lyrical takes, Kalala is haunting the past and the present moment by overwriting the spaces created by the time lags between each tag on. Okay, sorry. So by automating the spaces in between songs on Chapman's albums and imitating Brandon's vocal aesthetics against the dance and techno instrumentals, Kalala creates an alternative universe in history where she can position herself as an alternative musical lineage without overriding the histories that made her work possible. In effect, through her own constant self-repositioning, Kalala creates a way of relating between an experiential gap of racialization that is flexible enough to take into account the heterogeneity of those experiences that crosses lines of ethnicity, time, and sexuality, highlight and then models away beyond the epistemological limitations of the Illinois Black authentic. That's it. Sorry, guys.
Thanks so much, Adjua, for that awesome talk and also introducing me to Kalala and now download. I'm going to let Delise introduce our next speaker.
Yes, thank you, Atua. I always love starting my day with some brandy, so you got me right there. Our next speaker, Lisa K. Taylor. Her research explores theoretical, ethical, and practical directions in education for social change and local and global justice. Grounded in decolonial, feminist, anti-racist, and cultural studies, in psychoanalytic and post-reconceptualization curriculum theorizing. Her more recent research explores the ethical, psychic, and pedagogical dynamics of pedagogies of remembrance, Rogerizing, that seek to learn from historical memory of violence, genocide, and injustice, and mobilize effective and aesthetic engagement in building an activated public sphere. Does everybody understand? Because I'm French and this is very difficult. Okay. She is co-editor with Jasmine Zine of Muslim Women, Transnational Feminism, and the Ethics of Pedagogy. That was published this year with Routledge.
And that we launched just yesterday. Well, one of the launches. And I'm going to apologize. I'll be reading my paper. But the dovetailing is really fantastic. I organized a conference yesterday with a series of panels all around decolonizing feminism from anti-Islamophobic and indigenous perspectives and scholars. So it's, although it was hard to get up this morning, I'm glad I did. And the first panel was awesome, so thank you very much. I'll have a caveat in before I start. My fascination, my obsession is pedagogy, is education. But it's not what I'm dealing with in this part of the paper, the much larger paper that I'll be reading to you. Sorry, I won't read you the much larger paper. I'm reading you a section of it, and the section that I'm reading is not about pedagogy. But I'm going to say that if pedagogy is an answer or a response to the series of dilemmas that I'm posing in this section of the paper, including pedagogical dilemmas, I'm not getting there today, so sorry. So let me start off then. I, of course, want to acknowledge the Mohawk on whose territory this conference is taking place, and while there's always a risk of that kind of an introductory acknowledgement becoming tokenistic or catechistic, I think about a series of relationships that stem from my identification as a non-Indigenous treaty person living on Haudenosaunee, Six Nations territory, and teaching in Abenaki territory, and now here in Montreal, so I actually am pretty mobile. And I hope that some of those relationships and obligations shape the work that I do and the concerns that I share. Yay, okay. So in response to the theme of the conference, there's a series of questions that arise from my work. First of all, how do we understand zero future when futurist logics underpin our daily personal, institutional, and political lives? Secondly, what are the ethics of this question in our political projects of decolonizing the future? In his analysis of reproductive futurism, Lee Edelman examines the structuring optimism of politics. By this he means that our experience of the social is mediated through our attachment to our self-recognition within and materialization of social formations, such as nation, race, gender, class, that conform to a logic of futurism and initiate us as social subjects into a register of experience that is affectively structured by futurity. My paper today reads this understanding of the promissory nature of the social as well as psychic life against theorizations of temporalities of remembrance-based pedagogies. I'm working specifically with the work of Roger Simon, who was a mentor to me and passed away 2 years ago. So I'm reading those against remembrance-based pedagogies in order to form and inform my larger decolonial project of fostering amongst non-Indigenous pre-service teachers practices of transgenerational institutional remembrance and responsibility through courses that I teach, one in particular that reads testimonial literature by Indian residential school survivors. So it's a very specific topic that I'm talking on today. It's specifically around practices of memory within a state institution and complicit in genocide amongst people entering that and thinking about it as a transgenerational community with a series of obligations and implications in that. In case I don't get to all of it, I'll gesture to the larger paper. I'm arguing that there are figural logics structuring future teachers' optimistic attachments, and I'm using Lauren Berlant's ideas of optimism, attachments to ameliorative progressive discourses of schooling, and that these are structured by civilizational fantasies of racial redemption, assimilation as mobility or success. I'm also arguing that the figural logics of these civilizational fantasies can be both disrupted and reinvigorated when future teachers encounter representations of residential schools focused on the children sent there. My analysis in this paper worries about the experience of learning to teach as a dispersed, intimate public, a register of experience affectively structured by a colonial logic of futurity, made visible in the ambivalent, charged affects clustered around the figure of the child. Sorry, that's probably really small. It may get smaller as the slides go along. This paper reports on larger research I've been doing for many years, conducted as part of my response to the invitation to educators made by Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission to engage our broader society in the task of publicly witnessing and commemorating the testimonies of First Nations, Inuit, Métis residential school survivors as part of a historic process of revising the terms of our shared imaginaries, historiography, and citizenship. I approach this project of public remembrance and pedagogy wary of the challenges in initiating such conversations with non-Indigenous Canadians who bring uneven affective investments in a settler colonial multicultural neoliberal democracy, and attachments to the normative promises of education. Encounters with representations of the history and legacy of residential schools can, I believe, open up productive questions regarding teachers' positioning within an institution complicit in ongoing genocidal policies, but also concerning the affective and discursive horizons structuring their response to these encounters. In my teaching, I'm interested in non-Indigenous students' responses, and that's not to say that my classes aren't mixed, but in this paper I'm thinking around a particular affective structure and how it's colonial structured. So that's my reason to be focusing on non-Indigenous students' responses to photographic, filmic, literary, and testimonial texts addressing the history of trauma and survival. My analysis focuses on the pedagogical dilemma of teaching survival testimonial literature that centers to a substantial extent on traumatic childhood experience of colonial violence with predominantly non-Indigenous readers. And this is a timely question as well. The TRC has finished its work. It's delivering its report to Parliament next May, timing at the same time as Congress. And there's been a broad take-up in faculties of education and ministries of education to teaching the history of residential schools as part of the mandatory curriculum. Quebec has not responded in the ways that other provinces have, and let's hope that there's some impetus around that. But there is a broad impetus around Canada to making this history mandatory within curriculum. That then raises the how and the why and the what and all of that. So those are the areas of my thinking. There is, of course, a clear pedagogical dilemma underpinning my research. That's the question of why I would, as a non-Indigenous education professor, teach testimonial literature that foregrounds stories of childhood school experiences, because entire families and communities have been impacted by this policy and the larger colonial project of which it's part. For the moment, there are several reasons that counterbalance the potential risks of reducing the colonial project to the experience of children in residential schools underpinning my choice of texts. Some of those reasons are, these are the stories that survivors are telling us today. These are the stories that they're asking all Canadians to listen to. There's a consideration of historical accuracy there in terms of the experience was one of child students. There's also the enormity of the violation and therefore crime, And the case of residential schools is one example that dramatically exposes the genocidal brutality of ongoing land-directed colonial project. In other words, residential schools are a highly spectacular, synectical, I'll never know how to pronounce that word, synectical representation of cultural genocide comparable to the synectical image of Auschwitz for the Holocaust. Finally, I agree with Jennifer Henderson in her recent book, Reconciling Canada, that examining ongoing residential school legacies is an important way to break the presentism of decontextualized media representation of Indigenous families as somehow exemplary of social breakdown and in no need of explanation. There's a pedagogical dilemma that then arises. What kind of affects cluster around the figure of the child, and what futurist logics and optimistic attachments can they structure in a context of education as an institution of the settler colonial state and late capitalist neoliberal, settler colonial state and late capitalists neoliberal cultures of redress. So Lauren Berlant and Lee Edelman remind us that politics, but also our experience of social reality and identity, is always promissory and structured by futurity. In a Lacanian sense, through our entry into language and sociality, we sign up for and we sign our social lives away to an endlessly deferred sense of meaning and wholeness within a symbolic order that allows for our social recognition and membership. I should note my use of Edelman as a selective one. My concern here is not with debates over the past decade around the antisocial turn in queer theory, while those are fascinating. What I find useful in Edelman is a deconstructive approach to thinking against the logic of the social order and the structures to which we affectively commit, and to thinking in ways that attend to the price and differentially experienced cost of that social order. It's not that my own political commitments reject futurity. I'd situate myself within a continental tradition of critical idealism that conceives of an open-ended, mutually implicating relation of past, present, future. Roger Simon has argued that our responsibility to the past in a Derridian sense is not whether or not we were present or committed the acts, but whether or not the memory the past invoked in the present structures or influences our ways of engaging with others in the present, and the implicit promise that these actions make to a future to come. I say this even as I recognize the ongoing risk of a fall into new iterations of redemptionism in any pedagogical response to colonial violence within the contemporary, impoverished, neoliberal culture of redress. My interest in the figural structuring of futurity aims to examine how future teachers attach to colonial social orders through the social affect of optimism, as I struggle within my context of teaching in ways that create the condition for active accountability as treaty people. The logics that I'm trying to work with. So begin, what are the logics of futurity in education in settler colonial state, especially within contemporary cultures of redress? A central logic to normative social formations, according to many post-colonial scholars, is that of progress, with its attendant affect of optimism, and its ongoing cultural labor of reproducing a neoliberal, sexually and racially inflected capitalist social order. Berlant characterized optimism not as naive, but as a practice of finding a place to thrive phantasmatically within social forms that may be all we can perceive and to which we are attached as a point of predictable social convergence. In this sense, all attachment is a structure of relationality, and it is the desire one feels to sustain these relations and one's position within them that is optimistic. She writes again, whatever the experience of optimism, the affective structure of an optimistic attachment involves a sustaining inclination to return to the scene of fantasy that allows you to believe that this time the happiness promised by the object of desire will be yours. In No Future, Edelman argues that politics is structured heteronormatively through the logic of reproductive futurism, figured by the disciplinary image of the innocent child, the protection of whose innocence is ensured by and reproduces the current social order. In Cruel Optimism, Berlant traces the interlocking of futurist politics within capital accumulation and class dispossession through the figure of the American dream and post-war good life genres that persist in the face of accelerated dispossession, precarity, and crisis under capitalism. Hassan Hage, Sarah Ahmed, and Jasbir Poor trace the racial structuring of optimistic attachment to the white settler state and white Western gay consumer freedom that, in Poor's analysis, shifts the figural burden of queerness through logics of bio and necropolitics. There's a parallel in the hegemonic impact of these logics analyzed by Edelman, Berlant, Hage, Ahmed, and Poor, and the larger neoliberal logic that Jennifer Henderson discerns in late capitalist political culture, a neoliberal logic underpinning what Henderson and Wakeham call contemporary cultures of redress, is significant in its capacity to co-opt the claims made by redress movements for acknowledgement and restorative justice. Conversation last night around restorative versus restitutive justice. I won't go into that. And reframe these demands as critiques of an outdated interventionalist, paternalistic welfare state. This reframing of reconciliation within a charismatic neoliberal discourse is hegemonic in that it dissociates harm from structural inequality and historical legacies in ways that proposes neoliberal competitive individual opportunity as the solution. In state responses to redress movements, progress logics become amnesiac logics that unilaterally presume and enact apology and reconciliation in ways that hasten and seal a preemptive grasping at closure on the past. They reduce violent histories to the individualized aberrational crimes and outdated political cultures presumed to no longer pertain. Of course, I recognize the Enlightenment progress law. I've already said that. I'm arguing in this paper that the progress and individualizing neoliberal logics explored above can be discerned in the ambivalent charged affects mobilized around different representations and figurations of the child within different discursive contexts of reception for residential school survivor testimonial narratives. In her recent chapter in Reconciling Canada, Henderson worries about the currency of particular tropes circulated in contemporary cultures of redress. The trope of the carceral child and the trope of the deserving child, but also the interpretive frames and affective formations that they invite. As she argues, within a range of social justice and redress projects engaged in public pedagogies, the figure of the child seems to be the inescapable route through which harm becomes imaginable as deeply personal, and paradoxically universal in its sympathetic potential. She highlights the ways neoliberal policy agendas construct a discursive regime of recognition within which the deserving child becomes a node of condensation of human capital values, of potentiality, futurity, social investment, and legitimate entitlement to claims making, contrasted with claims making by groups characterized as special interest groups. While the figure of the deserving child is prominent in claims making projects, it's the figure of the carceral child that seems salient to the educational contexts and in the ways that it condenses the classic liberal understanding of confinement or negative freedom. Crucial to this image of the carceral child that Henderson sees being mobilized by several movements for redress, and she looks at the Ukrainian internment camp movement as well as residential schools, is the quality of innocence in the images of children. While politically effective, the figure of the carceral child invites a broader public to take up modes of sympathetic identification that recognize only individual, time-specific forms of harm or reparation and occlude collective legacies and implication. This decontextualization is exacerbated in political cultures that, and this is Berlant again, channel the clarity and certainty of moral outrage produced by the publicization of grief towards privatized forms of political participation, such as empathetic spectatorship. The dilemma here, then, is that when empathetic identification within an ahistorical figure of human rights is privatized and sentimentalized, it can work to reinforce the segregation of collective historical memory, fueling denial and dissociation. Think of the reaction, I didn't do it, I wasn't even born. I'm not sure if that, yeah. It's possible that the decontextualized and privatized responses of sympathy I'm referring to defend against the crisis that can be triggered in settler national attachment when facing ongoing histories of state-sponsored and enacted violence. Within Canada's settler colonial project, for example, it can be argued that belonging is affectually engaged through a shared sense of the historical present, a temporality that depends upon racialized ontological categories constructed within modernity coloniality. Post-colonial scholars have argued that settler colonial imaginaries forge national identity through a constitutive violence. And I'm using Ariella Azule's reference to Benjamin's thinking around constitutive versus other forms of violence. I'm going to start that again. Have argued that settler colonial imaginaries forge national identity through a constitutive violence that constructs First Nations peoples as racialized subjects outside the political community, left behind or absorbed within the wake of its evolutionary teleology of progress. I argue in this paper that this colonial temporality of belonging is experienced affectually by non-Indigenous Canadians through an intimate public, a vernacular sense of belonging, and a sense of ordinary life structured by this constitutive evacuation of Indigenous peoples from lived relations to the land, to community, and to futurity. In particular, education is experienced by non-Indigenous aspiring teachers, in much of my observation, not as a colonial institution of nation building, but rather as a structure of feeling. I'm going way back to Raven Williams there. Organized within the modern colonial register of promise, self-cultivation, and social amelioration in the context of a racially distributive economy of hope and potentiality, clustered around the figure of the child as student. In arguing this, my premise is grounded in substantial scholarship, noting a heavy investment by predominantly white female pre-service teachers in dreams of teaching that are saturated in imperial nostalgia, race, gendered, and sexual constructions of innocence, and redemptive narratives of learning. In their analysis of the decade-long SORI movement in Australia, in response to the 1997 Bringing Them Home report on the suffering of Aboriginal children in residential schools, Rosalind Diprose and Sarah Ahmed discern intense affective circuits of collective guilt and shame. Paradoxically, Ahmed identifies the ways these affects accrued to the image of a white Australian nation, an image that circulated in this movement as a felt community, an object of pride threatened by the shame of residential schools. Declarations of national shame, she argues, ambivalently reaffirmed an optimistic attachment to the nation, a desire to identify as a normative subject with a nation whose actions match its normative ideals through the cohering emotion of pride. Now, we could argue, following Sylvan Tompkins, that a host of affective co-assemblages are being collapsed in the term guilt, including shame, but also many others. Following Kleinian object relations, we could approach guilt as an affect associated with the conscience-constituting structure of the psyche, in which the recognition of another's suffering inspires remorse and a desire to repair, what Melanie Klein calls a depressive position, or Tompkin calls reparative strips. In a Kleinian sense, guilt, loss, and mourning are closely linked to maturation, because in recognizing and feeling anxiety for the other's suffering, I assume responsibility in my desire to repair. And indeed, my desire to repair can open me to hearing the other's Levinasian demand for infinite responsibilities in terms of reparation. One could conclude from this very work that the very work of reparative education lies in presenting students with evidence of great injustice or suffering, inciting their response, and then responding pedagogically in supportive ways that contain the psychic volatility of their efforts to grapple with their own implication in ongoing systems, institutions, and political cultures that maintain the conditions of this very suffering injustice they're studying. It follows that depressive reparative responses are crucial to students developing a sense of responsibility and expanded concern for complex, autonomous others in society who are not projections of their own fears or idealizations, but who do share a public sphere, a future, and a past. Very brief conclusion. This, to me, points to pedagogies of witnessing. What I'm developing then is a pedagogy of remembrance that introduces witnessing both as a practice and a temporality disruptive of colonial futurist logics. This is because, following Roger Simon's work, I consider that survivor testimonial literature and art unsettles, rends, or tears the relation between past and present by holding the present open, exposed, vulnerable, and naming its inherent incompleteness rather than the closure of presentism. I'm arguing then that decolonizing colonial temporalities demands the creation, through practices of witnessing, of a community of remembrance. On these terms, and I'm quoting Roger Simon again, remembrance becomes a social practice within which a collectivity considers how and on what terms we can admit accounts of the past into our contemporary moral community, such that they possess an active claim on our present and future actions in ways that do not reduce the terms of admittance to projections of our own identities and desires. Thank you.
Thank you both for super rich papers. I think you guys have opened up a lot of issues with the politics of temporality and also how affect plays into how we relate to time. So both with how the nostalgia in Kalela's music is a way of disrupting the present in a potentially productive way, and also how affective attachments to the future can be problematic in various ways. So I'll now open up to the group for questions.
Oh, sorry, I have a question for you, Adam.
Yeah.
You've done such a good job of showing us how certain ethnic subsets really well popular communities. And I wonder if there's any parallel histories people in Canadian music that you come across with diverse histories.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I guess, like the hip hop scene in Toronto would be like a really good example of that. Like, if you're kind of like old school, you kind of remember like people like Cardinal Official and like really old school like Sean Paul. And they kind of, so they kind of inject sort of like, actually, yeah, like, so like hip hop, like if you look at the history of hip hop, it's actually created by Jamaican migrants. And so by infusing sort of like dance hall like aesthetics to kind of like Canadian hip hop, they kind of harken back to a history of hip hop while at the same time kind of creating their own kind of like sensitivities to it. So yeah, maybe that would be a good example. As for, I know there are others, I just can't think of any right now, but yeah, that I think that's do for now. I hope that helps. Answers your question.
My question's for Adam. Just thinking about the discussion in Detroit techno and like Zer0 and all that sort of fascination with the backward kind of concept of like man, machine, hybrid and stuff. Do you see and I'm thinking of that in relation to Kula's kind of
conversation. Yeah, I think I do. I mean, so Kilowatt's music kind of comes up, and especially like, you know, we follow sort of like R&B now. A lot of it is sort of kind of like influenced by like heavy techno or whatever, but this kind of started in like the early 2000s, like Beyonce. I feel like I'm just talking about people on the tier right now, like music wise. Like, okay, but like if you, there's actually, I forgot her name. I think it's Robin Ray. I think I'm correct in that. But basically, she talks a lot about sort of this kind of like what she calls a robo diva trope that kind of like Beyonce and people like Rihanna kind of take on. This sort of like undermining the binary between sort of like, you know, woman or sorry, nature and machine or technological, and then woman being on sort of the natural side of things, and then sort of man and progress being on. So how it kind of sort of perpetuates this kind of very gendered binary. And she's saying that by appropriating those kind of tropes, people like Beyonce and Rihanna kind of complicate our understandings of technology and sort of like post-human subjectivities as they relate to race and class, right? So, I mean, I think Kalala is kind of just continuing on that tradition, but she's doing it in sort of in more subtle ways and in ways that kind of pays more homage to kind of older forms of like R&B, like you know, 1960s, like, well, I mentioned 90s girl groups, but even farther back, I would even say to people like, I mentioned Tracy Chapman, but I would even say sort of like girl groups from the 60s, as far back as that, just in how she really doubles down on sort of like soulful interpretations of or soulful aesthetics to understand. I hope that kind of is to understand.
Actually, I have a question, so I'll jump before anyone else does. It's also a question for Atwa. I was just wondering, because when we look, Sylvia Winter and other scholars have written about it, how blackness was created, let's say, since 1492 and after, with slavery and colonialism,
Right.
and that slavery was a moment and a historic moment that created a whole new people.
Right.
And
Right.
the Americas here, black people are the only ones who were created by what happened here. And that history created a people, but we also created ourselves,
Yeah.
right? Because we had to, we had to create a whole new community, a whole new, a language. Even when we look in the Caribbean, that they had to create their own language, our culture, spiritual, a whole new spirituality. So I was wondering, how is that different from what we second generation African girls and women who have migrated here, we also have to recreate ourselves anew. In the new society, we cannot remain what we were or what other people in our home countries are. How is that process different?
Okay, yeah. I was like, I'm trying to figure out a way to like answer your question. Like, I think it's an awesome question, and it's kind of like the basis of everything I'm doing right now. But yeah. So I think in my paper I talk a little bit how first or second generation Black kids have to sort of grapple with their own history. So their histories from like their parents either coming from like Africa or like Caribbean or whatever, and then also on top of that having to deal with the fact that within a sort of North American racial kind of like framework that they're kind of always put along this kind of like African American sort of temporality, right? Like they're not, so they have to kind of deal with multiple temporalities at once. And so I think, sorry, can you just go back to your like question one more time? I got lost in my own train of thought.
Because I just find that young girls who have born second generation or even afterwards,
Yeah, or migrants.
migrants,
Yeah.
our process of identification of creating our own culture,
Yeah.
other Black people
Mhm.
have had to do it too.
Right. Yeah, and so you're asking how.
How is it different?
Yeah. I think it's different just because of that. Because, like for instance, if you're, I would assume if you're African American, I'm very much generalizing here, you have sort of this kind of framework to work with already, right? This North American framework of you're descendants of slaves, or your family's descendants of slaves, and then, you know, maybe you're in the States, your family migrated up north, blah, blah, there's like a kind of a history that you already are working with. I think with what differentiates sort of Black migrants and second generation Black kids is that they're just dealing with that, being placed on that history, and then again also having histories of usually colonialism or different histories of slavery from, like, say, the Caribbean or like South America. So is having to create basically an identity that addresses both those like temporalities, and I think that's how it differs. So we have to negotiate that.
Carrie? Thanks both. Really interesting talks. I have questions for both of you. They're very different. So I'll ask the question to Lisa first and then Ottawa. Lisa, I'm wondering, in this model that you're kind of laying out, theorizing for us, what is justice? Or what ought justice be? And what ought justice look like, and how should it be performed in the context where we are talking about performative events in terms of testimony and practice? And I'm wondering, you mentioned restorative versus restitutive justice, and I'm wondering if that's either part of the problem or pointing in a particular direction for you. You also mentioned decolonial feminism as something you were just talking about yesterday, whether that had any, whether that's part of how you're thinking about justice within this context. So that's my question for you, to hear what you're thinking of that. I was really struck by the ways in which Malala's music and the ways you're talking about are not based on a model of sort of autobiography or testimonial in terms of telling an experience of being second generation, but is instead about texture, about sound, about genealogies of sound. And I wonder for you sort of how you think about that. Like, is this a different model of the autobiographical from a kind of Black feminist framework within the context of being a child of migrants? Just sort of how we think about that as a kind of model of cultural production.
Sure. Thank you for that. That's a really big question that I could run for hours. No, it's a really important one. It takes me back to actually one of the conversations yesterday with Cheryl Suzak, who's prophet of Aboriginal Studies at U of T, and looks at Indigenous women's embodiments of justice and the ways that those do or don't mesh with discourses of the law. There are ways in which gendered experience, let alone colonized experience, there are ways in which there's, for it to become visible within a discursive regime of the law, is already to colonize. It is already to selectively, visibility will always be selective. It's a process of translation, but translation always flirts with co-optation, those processes, especially translation that attends to the original being translated and the costs and the price of that, and that's often embodied of the process of translation. All of that gets riven, sort of peeled away from that, and it gets reduced to what the law can recognize. The law is necessarily Rawlsian liberalist. It recognizes automized, autonomous individual selves. It has a sense beyond its presentism of case history. So when we come into justice, I mean, maybe I should step back and just say a lot of my thinking around justice is influenced by Levinas, is influenced by Derridian thinking, but it's also influenced by Indigenous scholars who talk about those who have faced the injustice being the ones to define what reparation would look like. And because there is then an attention to what cannot be made visible in the reparation itself. In my work in pedagogy, what would justice look like? Because justice, Levinas says, justice is before politics. It's not the same as politics. Justice is attending to all of the possibilities that politics has to attend to. So my work in the context of institutionalized schooling and the preparation of people to enter institutionalized schooling faces a whole range of compromises that sit uncomfortably with me. But some of the things that I'm sketching is that remembrance as a pedagogy builds a transactional public sphere that attends to divergent memory. And that aims for opening, aperture rather than closure, which is antithetical to most curriculum and most approaches to teaching that aim very much for closure. So there's a tension, but that's hopefully a productive and not just an agonizing tension.
Sorry, can people hear when we're not speaking into mics, or do we want to speak into the mics? No. Okay, so can you?
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I think one of the reasons why the focus is less like autobiographical and more sort of on like the textual aspects of the music, or like of her singing voice and collage music, and also how I approached it in the paper, is because when I'm trying to kind of challenge, I guess, is sort of like this notion, or this kind of what I find a very homogenizing understanding of Black identity formation that is, I think, not allowing like enough space for us to kind of think of other ways, or sort of how Black migrants kind of complicate that notion. So with Paul Gilroy's idea of the Black Atlantic, it's very sort of, like I said, like super masculinist, and it's also very super tied to sort of, this kind of like everyone goes through this sort of same linear process of Black identity formation. And I think by focusing on sort of like the effective responses that you have to music, or how people interpret certain genres of music, then you kind of allow more space for discussing differences within those experiences. So I think with Kalala and myself, and focusing sort of like, again, the sort of textual aspects of it, I think it just allows kind of more generative ways for us to approach kind of differences within ethnic groups that recognizes those differences, but then that also provides space for us to draw kind of affinities when needed. I think that's what I was going.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that? Okay, so is that because you think like affects travel in non-linear ways? Like, what is it about like affective response to music, let's say, that makes you get out of this like idea of a linear Black identity formation?
Okay, that's a really awesome question. I'm gonna have to like think about it a little bit. Okay, I think what it is, no, it's cool. I'm gonna work it out. I guess maybe I'll just have to like go back to like my answer to Carrie's question. It's just more like a case of, I think when the thing about affect is that I think it kind of avoids linearity in terms of how we I guess kind of frame it, I guess, but also in terms of like by focusing on like effective responses, again, I think it does. I think something about it kind of just anticipates difference in terms of how we would respond to it. But then I think the point is that it causes a response as opposed to it causes a certain kind of way of identifying with something. So the difference becomes the starting point as opposed to the identity or like the commonalities or whatever. If that makes sense. Yeah. Okay, cool.
Do you have any other questions?
Yes.
A question for Lisa, or kind of an expansion of the dilemma that you put forward about children as the subject of history and testimonies, but then also once you get into pedagogy and developing a curriculum that children are now the recipients of that, is there still that kind of sense of this optimism of their future and that they're the so we've stolen futures or potentiality from some children and now they're laying responsibility on another generation of children? Is that how you kind of look at the transfer of that colonization of children into the subject?
Yeah, there's so many layers of that, eh? That's yeah, you're putting it really nicely because we're looking at layers of mediation in this process here, right? The process of creating curriculum that will be taught in schools is one of testimony in which adults speak of their child self, but also and speak across silences across generations, are heard by adults like myself who then create curriculum for other younger adults who are going to, I mean, our culture is such an identification-based culture. So the first reception of these texts is one of a form of identification that can also be, that can be highly projective, right? Those kinds of sympathetic responses that are about the projecting of a self onto a fantasy of childhood. And there are tremendous anxieties that come up. There was a piece by a really good colleague of mine, Sarah Matthews, looking at pre-service teachers' responses to Hitler's car that is in the War Museum in Ottawa. And not just her, she took a class of future teachers to the War Museum, and she watched these younger adults being really upset about the response of a group of school kids who were there and saying, wow, cool, that's Hitler's car. And so what she opened up there are the sorts of anxieties around visions of childhood that underpin the genre of learning to teach as an experience and the ways that curriculum itself is a projection. You're saying, and now there's the layer of children receiving that in ways that are probably going to be pretty sanitized and probably going to also, again, public school curriculum generally reverts to identification-based forms of knowing the past, what Pinkerton calls sentimental histories, right? What if this was you? What would you have done? There's a possibility of over-theorizing all of this and just say, well, to some degree, let's trust that stories have some, especially when they're not mediated too many times. There is a certain importance in children hearing stories directly from survivors, I think, or that there being an intergenerational conversation happening there, and that some trust could be put into what that embodied engagement allows for. So there's going to be a whole mess of identification going on, and misidentification, and recognitions and misrecognitions going on in that whole process there. Coming back to a question around justice through all of that often comes down to very simple questions like at the end of the course, I didn't talk much about it, but at the end of the course, I asked my students to write a series of letters. One letter is to two people who come to visit my classroom. One, Karen Jacobs, is a teacher in the BEd program. So she took the course with me, said, I didn't like the way you did the whole Indigenous stuff. And I said, okay, teach it with me. And she teaches it with me. And so there's a letter to her There's a letter to Ina Grey-Eyes, an elder who is an artist and who speaks for the class. So there's the thank you for your testimony, this is what I plan to do with it, this is what it recalls for me letter. There's a letter that is an impossible letter to a survivor whose story is dramatized in the NFB film We Were Children, who didn't live to see the publication of the film, Glenn Anaquad. So it's an impossible letter. Again, what will I do with your story? What did it mean to you to go through the effort to bring that story to me? And then I asked them to write a third letter to their future child who comes home from school and talks about their best friend getting really pissed off about how the curriculum is lying and how this land was stolen and our very house is on stolen land. And the child turns to the parent and says, what's this got to do with our family? What should I do? I want to stay friends. And so there's a commitment to sharing space, but it's this sort of future speculative form of creative writing. So in that sense, for me, justice at least has to be something that attends to what story brings us and what we do with it. Long-winded answers.
Since you brought up actually notions of identification, I was wondering if you could unpack this phrase in your talk that stuck out for me, which was the colonial temporality of belonging.
Yeah.
And I think when you brought that up, you kind of like gestured toward a potentially a different way of relating that's outside of belonging, because belonging obviously conventionally is with notions of identification and by now sort of misidentification and disidentification. And I was wondering if you could just like, break down what you meant by that and also talk about, resistance within that.
Right. So I'm drawing a fair bit from Ariella Azule's work. She has some really interesting books recently. The Civil Contract of Photography. In fact, the other one is blanking. So she works with archives of the creation of Israel-Palestine Red Cross photographic archives, and asks into the constitutive violence in which the very categories of citizenship were being formed through the visual regimes of photography, the category of refugee, the category of citizen, the category of Palestinian and Israeli. So in that sense, she's invoking Benjamin to think about violence. I mean, this is Gayatri Spivak's symbolic violence too. It's not just in representation, but it's in the creation of the categories through which representation comes to exist. And those categories have a temporality to them. So the categories of citizenship within Canada as a settler colonial state also have a temporality of them. There's a constitutive evacuation of First Nations people from a sense of the present. And I think one could simplify that a lot and simply say colonial temporalities evacuate Indigenous peoples and place them within the past, but that is lived then, and that within education, that's lived as education becomes a sort of, when directed to Indigenous children, Duncan Campbell Scott said, we're killing the Indian and the child. When it's directed to Indigenous children, it becomes a sort of modernizing process that is social mobility or the promise of education as social mobility through racial assimilation. And that racial assimilation is itself a temporal process. I'm not being very clear there, but yeah. Thanks for your question. Increasingly, my approach to pedagogy is one that doesn't seek one answer. It's one that seeks a number of entry points into a question, and those entry points are in a kind of contrapuntal tension with each other. So representations of the child can't be need themselves to work against the workings of their reception, if that makes sense. There need to be points of listening to the adults, looking back on childhood. There need to be, like the child has to be put in motion, has to be engaged as not a figure, but as a three-dimensional being in motion and in time. So that would be sort of that means bringing in intergenerational, eavesdropping in on intergenerational conversations. So what I like about the memoirs is that there is that tension of the adult looking back onto childhood and asking you to move through that. So the child is not a still figure. The child looks back and speaks back. There are ways in which that figure of the child is going to speak to one's own conflicted experiences and projections and fantasies of childhood. Those have to, there has to be an opportunity to explore those. And increasingly I feel like there has to be an opportunity, particularly for non-Indigenous Canadians and for Canadians who migrate to Canada from from colonial histories as well, who are offered this kind of colonial citizenship as Canadian citizenship. So there needs to be a way to desegregate family histories as well. So to think about generational communities, both within one's own implication and within the survivors that you're listening to. Does that make sense? Not really. I could say that really simply and just say I think there needs to be a diversity of the voices of children that are being heard, and there needs to be a way to hear the diversity and the entanglements of colonialism that one brings as a listener, and that one brings tangled histories that have been sanitized and segregated, and that a retangling of those maybe can start to chip away at the sorts of things that happen around a figure when that figure is idealized, is seen as an abstraction. It takes away from the abstraction of the figure. And then there are a whole bunch of sort of activities that I play with that I won't go into. And then they're usually met with these, typical, I see patterns in the responses to the child. The response can be the anthropological one that wants to know more about the other. The response can be the empathetic one that wants to feel the other. And both of those need to be unsettled and placed against each other. Thank you for your question.
Do we have one last question before we close? Okay, so I think we'll launch into the future of lunch now. I want to thank Adja and Lisa for tremendous talks and stimulating discussion period. Thank you guys for being here. Thanks to Lise for accepting my last minute invitation to be here with us today. Just to let you know, the next panel is called Futures. Oh, would you like to do that? Okay.
Sorry to interrupt. We've made a few changes to the afternoon schedule because unfortunately 2 of our presenters on the next panel, one has had a death in the family. That's Rosalind, so she's not going to be able to speak. And we've just heard from Polly, who is currently in the emergency room and can't speak today. So we're really sad and hoping everything is okay. So we're going to give a little bit more time for lunch. So we'll have the next panel, which will be McGill.
Hello.
With your awesome chair and moderator, Bobby. But just move that back 15 minutes. So we'll start at 2:15. So we're just going to build a little bit of time into the schedule there. And then we're going to start Itasha's talk and interview with Tobias at 3 o'clock, so we can have far more time for discussion and for them to have a conversation.
about Afrofuturism, which both Eleanor and Adwa have started to bring up and to sort of start the conversation. But we'll move that up a bit. It's because we were a little bit tight on time, and that just gives us a little more flexibility and time for conversation. So we'll break for lunch, come back at 2:15, and then we'll have the keynote at 3. Okay? Thank you, everyone. Thank you.